By the 1760s, Boston had grown into one of the most significant settlements in British North America. A packed harbor defined by commerce, authority, and mounting unrest. Within one generation, the settlement would be pushed through rebellion, marked by warfare, and remade as part of a fresh nation. In this video, I use contemporary AI technology to animate historical paintings, charts, and illustrations, adjusting viewpoint, altering camera positions, and navigating through these images in ways their creators never envisioned. The aim isn't simply to observe the past, but to enter it, to travel through Boston as it existed and consider what it might have felt like to be present here, from founding to uprising. And if you remain until the conclusion, we'll contrast these identical locations to their appearance today to reveal what time has altered and what still endures. Before we enter Old Boston, it's useful to examine how this narrative started. This artwork depicts the landing of the Winthrop expedition in New England in 1630, commanded by John Winthrop. These vessels transported colonists to the Massachusetts Bay, establishing the foundation for what would shortly become Boston. Picture reaching this unknown section of shoreline, disembarking without understanding what waited beyond, only that everything you aspired to create would start here. Just before we advance into the 18th century, I want to stop here briefly. This picture shows Boston's initial meeting house, originally constructed in 1632, only several years after the colony was established. The illustration itself was produced much later, but it probably represents how the structure would have looked, plain, practical, and essential to daily existence. The meeting house stood near present-day State Street, adjacent to the center of modern downtown Boston, demonstrating how tightly the settlement's earliest foundations still correspond with its current arrangement. On the journey toward the 18th century, it's valuable to pause momentarily to observe scenes like this, a Boston still hushed, tentative, and only starting to form. This picture is not a period sketch, but it conveys the nature of a much smaller colonial settlement long before the crowded lanes and active waterfront of the 1700s. Simple timber structures border dirt pathways with vessels moored near the coastline, and everyday existence proceeding at a gentler, more precarious rhythm. Images like this help anchor us in a period when Boston was less a metropolis and more an attempt, still discovering its place in a new territory. If I could visit this location with what I understand today, I think I'd recognize it as one of the earliest foundations of what would eventually be called the American Dream. This illustration dates to the early 1720s and presents the settlement as it looked from the waterfront, already identifiable in fundamental ways today. In the foreground is Boston Harbor, filled with vessels that drove the settlement's Atlantic economy. No longer a vulnerable outpost, but an expanding port whose thoroughfares, harbor, and horizon still define the metropolis we recognize now. To better display Long Wharf, I've included this 1743 illustration, which makes its magnitude and significance clearer to observe. Here, Long Wharf reaches prominently into the harbor near the middle of the perspective, jutting farther into the water than the adjacent docks and piers, and functioning as one of Boston's principal connections to the Atlantic world. From this location, vessels arriving from Europe and the Caribbean offloaded merchandise, travelers came ashore, and Boston created its initial impact on those approaching by water. A defining waterfront monument whose location and shape can still be traced and visited in the settlement today. Rising beyond it are church towers marking the community's districts, including Christ Church in the North End, later recognized as Old North Church, which still stands today. Observed together, these monuments show Boston on the edge of change. No longer a vulnerable outpost, but an expanding port whose thoroughfares, harbor, and horizon still define the metropolis we recognize now. This picture shows Boston Light, the initial lighthouse constructed in what would become the United States, finished in 1716 on Little Brewster Island at the entrance to Boston Harbor. For arriving vessels, It was often the initial indication of shore after a lengthy Atlantic voyage. Picture finally spotting this beacon after weeks or even months on the ocean, a marker that the journey was concluding and that the hope of fresh possibility was finally within grasp. During the Revolutionary War, the original tower was intentionally demolished by British troops in 1776 as they evacuated from Boston. But it was reconstructed just a few years afterward in 1783, and remarkably, Boston Light still stands on the identical location today, continuing to direct vessels into the harbor more than 3 centuries later. This illustration shows Castle William, the principal fortress protecting the entrance to Boston Harbor in the early 18th century. Situated on Castle Island, it commanded the restricted passages to the community and represented British military power in the colony. For vessels entering the harbor, its cannons were a reminder that Boston was not merely a harbor of possibility, but a location watched, protected, and solidly connected to imperial authority. Departing the ocean, we arrive onto shore just across the waterway in Cambridge, a community already closely connected to Boston's existence and destiny. At this period, this was Harvard College, a modest but significant center of education in colonial New England. Long before it became a worldwide university, Harvard existed to prepare clergy and civic leaders for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In this perspective, 3 early structures define the college yard. On the left stands Harvard Hall, utilized for instruction and daily teaching. At the middle is Stoughton Hall, constructed as student lodging as the college gradually grew. And on the right is Massachusetts Hall, completed in 1720 and still standing today, the oldest surviving structure at Harvard. Understanding what we understand now, it's remarkable to consider how unremarkable this location must have seemed at the time. Being here observing around, sensing the people, it's simple to picture walking these grounds without understanding what the destiny would bring, only that something significant was beginning to develop. This picture shows the old State House in Boston around the mid-18th century, one of the most significant public structures in the community at the period. It functioned as the center of colonial administration, where regulations were discussed, levies imposed, and royal power was applied in the years preceding the uprising. From this very structure, announcements were proclaimed aloud to crowds assembled below, and it stood at the middle of Boston's civic existence. Today, it still stands in the center of the settlement, a rare survivor from this period, silently observing how the lanes around it would shortly become a platform for history. This scene shows Boston Common in the late 1760s, one of the oldest public areas in the settlement. At the period, it was a communal ground utilized for grazing livestock, public assemblies, military exercises, and everyday recreation. British soldiers frequently trained here, sometimes within view of townspeople conducting their activities, a subtle but persistent reminder of imperial occupation. In the distance stands the Province House, the official home of the royal governors of Massachusetts, overlooking the Common as a representation of British power. Today, this area is still recognized as Boston Common, now a public park at the center of the settlement. But in the years before the uprising, it was a location where regular existence and mounting pressure existed side by side. Being here now, I can't help but envision what it must have been like. People crossing the Common, children playing around, soldiers exercising nearby, all of it part of everyday existence. At the period, it probably seemed like just another regular day without any awareness that within a decade, this would become part of an independent nation. I can't be in Boston on the brink of rebellion and not pause here. This scene shows the events of December 1773 when colonists boarded vessels in Boston Harbor and threw chests of tea into the water in opposition to British taxation. Some of the men concealed themselves as Mohawk Indians, partly to hide their identities and partly to present the action as something distinctly American rather than British. At the period, It wasn't called the Boston Tea Party. It was a calculated action meant to deliver a message, not generate a display, just a choice carried out in the freezing harbor that pushed Boston one step nearer to open defiance. This is the Green Dragon Tavern, one of the most renowned gathering locations in pre-revolutionary Boston. By the 1760s and early 1770s, it was far more than a location to drink. It functioned as an unofficial headquarters where traders, craftsmen, dock laborers, and political organizers assembled to discuss British policies and arrange resistance. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty are understood to have gathered here, using its private chambers to organize protests, exchange intelligence, and coordinate responses to events like fresh taxes. In locations like this, the revolution didn't start with speeches or proclamations, but with discussions shaped by frustration, doubt, and a mounting sense that the existing order was no longer functioning. This is Faneuil Hall in 1775, often labeled the Cradle of Liberty. By this stage, the structure was already firmly established as Boston's primary gathering location, a marketplace on the lower level, and above it, a chamber where town assemblies, discussions, and demonstrations occurred. It was here that Bostonians assembled to dispute over levies, representation, and the expanding presence of British power, sometimes filling the chamber shoulder to shoulder as pressures mounted. By the eve of the uprising, Faneuil Hall had become a location where public sentiment was formed in the open, where speeches transformed frustration into action, and where the concept of resistance moved from private discussions into the lanes outside. The structure still stands today, but in moments like this, it was less a monument and more a pressure point, a space where a settlement struggled with what it was about to become. This picture shows a triumphal arch constructed in Boston in 1789 to greet George Washington as president of a newly independent nation. The arch itself was temporary, erected just for this occasion, but what it represented was enduring. Though built of timber, it was carefully finished to appear like stone, giving it the look of permanence at a moment when the nation itself was still fresh. Only several years earlier, these lanes had been filled with opposition and doubt. Now they were prepared for celebration. For the people standing here, this wasn't simply a visit. It was evidence that the revolution had led somewhere. The colonies were no longer struggling to become something. They were something. Picture being there, observing the settlement step into history, no longer part of an empire, but part of something completely new. This is Christ Church, recognized today as the Old North Church, finished in 1723. Decades before the American Revolution, long before it became connected with famous signals and midnight rides, it stood as a familiar Anglican church in Boston's North End. The pictures we're examining come from different moments. One attempts to reconstruct how the church and its surroundings would have looked in the 18th century, while the other dates from probably 1807, displaying the structure as it stood in the early years of the new republic. Together, they give us a sense of continuity, a building that remained anchored in location as the world around it transformed. Not long after these early years, this quiet church would be drawn into events far beyond its original function. From this tower came a simple signal, 2 lanterns warning the British troops were advancing by sea. What had once been a location of routine and worship suddenly became part of the larger narrative unfolding across the settlement. At the time, nothing about this spot would have indicated the role it was about to perform. It was simply part of the neighborhood, woven into everyday existence, unaware that it would soon be remembered as one of the locations where everything began to shift. Now, I want to bring you into the present and show how these locations look today. Thanks for being here. And if you have thoughts or requests for future settlements, Share them in the comments. Let's get into it. This illustration shows Boston's initial meeting house from 1632, once standing along what is now State Street. What began as a modest wooden structure at the edge of a small colony has since become one of Boston's busiest thoroughfares, with no visible trace of where the community first assembled. This 1723 view shows Boston as a low-packed harbor community shaped by the ocean. Today, that same coastline is filled, developed, and transformed into a modern skyline, but the harbor is still the settlement's center. This picture shows the original Boston Light as it looked in the 1720s. That first lighthouse was later demolished by British forces in 1776. What stands on this island today is a reconstruction, completed in 1783. It remains the oldest continually used lighthouse site in America. This illustration shows Castle William in the early 1700s protecting Boston Harbor for the British. Damaged during the British withdrawal in 1776, it was later reconstructed by Americans. Its walls still stand today, overlooking a very different harbor. This illustration shows Harvard's early campus, as it developed in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Of these structures, only Massachusetts Hall still stands. Constructed in 1720, it survived the Revolution and remains the oldest structure at Harvard still in use. Today, the old State House is still here, nearly unchanged, but now encircled by modern towers. What was once the center of colonial authority sits quietly inside a modern settlement, one of the few locations where Boston's revolutionary past still stands in place. In 1768, the Boston Common was open grazing land and public ground where people walked, trained, and gathered at the edge of a small community. Today, the same area remains Boston's oldest public park. No longer pasture, but still a shared commons surrounded by a modern settlement that grew up around it. Faneuil Hall, as it looked in 1775 when it was already a center of discussion and opposition on the eve of rebellion, today the structure still stands on the same spot surrounded by crowds once again, no longer disputing independence but carrying on the life of a settlement shaped by what occurred here. The Old North Church still rises above the lane much as it did in the 1700s. The settlement has closed in around it, but the church remains the same anchor. Once a quiet colonial monument, it now stands surrounded by modern Boston, observing over the same lanes where history first unfolded. Standing here looking at these transformations, it strikes me how rare it is to see a place where so much history remains visible. Most cities either preserve nothing or turn everything into a museum. But Boston managed something different. It kept growing, kept changing, while letting pieces of its revolutionary past stay woven into everyday life. The harbor still defines it, the common still anchors it, and churches like this one still stand watch over streets that once carried the weight of a nation being born. Thanks for exploring 18th century Boston with me. If you want to see more cities brought to life through AI animation, subscribe and check out the video on screen now. Your suggestions for future locations always guide what we cover next. Drop them in the comments below.